Marcia Angell, who's our keynote speaker, had written a book a number of years ago about the drug companies, and I took my practice through a process of going farm-free in 2005, and it was her book that largely swayed those independent voters in the middle of my practice to moving from an I don't care position to, oh yes, we want to be farm-free. So I'm very excited to have this opportunity. So Marcia Angell is a senior lecturer in the Department of Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School. She stepped down as the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine in 2000. A graduate of Boston University School of Medicine, she trained in both internal medicine and anatomic pathology and is a board-certified pathologist. She joined the editorial staff of the New England Journal of Medicine in 1979, became the executive editor in 1988, and editor-in-chief in 1999. She is an accomplished author in both the lay press and the scientific press. And she was, and this is I didn't know, was in 1997 the Time magazine, or one of the 25 most influential Americans. So that's pretty cool. So without further ado, please welcome Marcia Angell.
Thank you very much, Dave. You know, a story like your practice going farm-free is one of the best things an author can hear. I mean, it makes all of that work worthwhile. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you today. And not surprisingly, I'm going to be talking about going farm-free, but mainly about medical journals going farm-free. Most of us hope that doctors get their information from medical journals instead of from drug company sales reps or industry-sponsored pitches at five-course dinners. That's what we would like. We would like to get our information from medical journals. The assumption is that medical journals are not biased and that as a result, they're credible. But is that true? And if it isn't, what's the alternative? How can you get your information? How can doctors get valid and reliable information about the treatments they prescribe? The reality is complicated because there are thousands of journals, and they vary greatly. Most, unfortunately, are really marketing tools for industry. That is, they're supported entirely by industry and given to doctors free of charge, whether they want them or not. They publish no original research, just superficial review articles slanted toward their advertisers' products. In short, they exist to sell drugs and devices. In the parlance of the trade, they're called giveaways or throwaways. These are the things that stuff your mailbox. At the other extreme are a small number of well-regarded journals that attempt, more or less, to publish unbiased original research. These include the handful of general medical journals that have the highest impact and are most closely watched by the media and the public. The New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the Lancet, the British Medical Journal, as well as some specialty journals and the newer online journals such as PLOS. Although most of them are also dependent on industry ads, they also have paid subscribers. Most are owned by medical associations or specialty societies. The New England Journal of Medicine, for example, is owned by the Massachusetts Medical Society. Between these two extremes, between the vast number of industry throwaways and a small number of journals that try to be independent of industry influence, are a large number of specialty journals that publish some research, but also publish industry-supported supplements that essentially promote drugs by featuring in these supplements the medical conditions that their sponsors' products are designed to treat. Historically, a distinction was made between peer-reviewed journals and the others, But the concept of peer review has been stretched so thin that it may now refer to any sharing of manuscripts with close colleagues or with the editor's brother-in-law. So it doesn't mean very much anymore as a good housekeeping seal of approval. It's become virtually meaningless as a distinction. It's also meaningless to distinguish journals by whether they're published by nonprofit organizations. Yes, for-profit groups certainly see their journals as a source of income, but nowadays the nonprofits also seek to maximize income, not just to break even, and they are as eager for ads as the for-profits. I stepped down as editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine in the year 2000 after 21 years on the editorial staff. The New England Journal of Medicine was, and still is, generally regarded as the preeminent general medical journal in the world. So it occupied a special position. We had nearly 200,000 paid subscribers when I joined the staff in 1979, far more than any other medical journal. We accepted only about 10% of the manuscripts that were submitted to us, which allowed us to be extremely selective about what we published. And we had a long tradition of the editor-in-chief having authority over the business and advertising staff. So we were very, very privileged. Our income was enough to make the Massachusetts Medical Society per member the richest medical association in the country, even richer than the AMA. About half of that income came from subscriptions to the New England Journal and half from advertising. We carried a lot of ads, but these too were under the ultimate control of the editor-in-chief, and we established strict guidelines governing them. Ads, for example, could be only for FDA-approved drugs. They could not be interleaved with editorial content, and they could not look like editorial content. That is, we would not accept advertorials. We also did not accept ads that we, the editors, found misleading or tasteless, and that included multi-page ads that attracted too much attention to any one drug. You know, scratch and sniff sorts of ads, or pop-ups, or 8-page ads. We just out of hand said no to those. Other than laying down these general guidelines, which required us to look at occasional ads, the advertising people would send them over to us to see whether it violated any of our standards. Other than that, we did not review ads routinely. There was a firewall between us and the advertising people who were located at the Massachusetts Medical Society headquarters several miles from the editorial offices. They didn't know what papers we scheduled for publication, and we didn't know what ads they scheduled. We sold reprints to drug companies, sometimes in great bulk, but we insisted that when they were distributed, they were not stamped with the company logo or otherwise altered. Not surprisingly, then, drug companies frequently complained about our restrictive policies and sometimes threatened to pull out their ads. But because we had so many advertisers, we ignored the occasional threats. Suppose, though, they had all threatened to pull out their ads together. Suppose they'd gotten together and said, we're going to stop advertising the New England Journal of Medicine. What then? And I'll get back to that later. But despite our privileged position, we were not immune to the growing influence of industry over my 2 decades at the New England Journal. These were the decades when medicine was largely transformed from a healing profession to a commercial enterprise. It happened before my very eyes. I won't spell out the reasons for this transformation or the details, except to say that the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine was the first to call public attention to it. In 1980, Bud Relman, and in the interest of full disclosure, I confess that he is now my husband, published his seminal article, The New Medical Industrial Complex, which he titled to parallel President Eisenhower's warning about a military-industrial complex. In that article, he described the nascent and largely hidden commercialization of medicine. Healthcare was becoming a commodity and not a social service. Although this transformation didn't affect medical journals initially, over the next few years, we began to see the ripple effects. Drug and device companies came to believe that since they paid for much of the clinical research on their products, they should have more control over how their money was spent. Now, the fact that industry sponsored most clinical research on their products, on drugs and devices, wasn't new. They had always done that. Since drug and device companies have no direct access to patients in whom to test their products, they needed investigators at academic medical centers who could enroll patients from teaching hospitals and clinics. So they had always had to do this, to go to the academic medical centers to get their patients. What was new, what changed dramatically over the 2 decades, were the terms of the sponsorship. Until the 1980s, clinical trials were designed by academic researchers who believed the question was scientifically important. Investigators retained the data, it was their data, or it was their institution's data. They analyzed and interpreted the results. They wrote the papers, and they decided whether and where to submit them for publication. This is until the 1980s. Sponsoring companies simply stood back and hoped that their products looked good. In other words, research grants were at arm's length. In addition, investigators generally had no other financial ties to the sponsoring company, nor did their institutions. I don't have the time here to discuss all of the reasons this arm's length relationship changed between investigators and sponsors, the reasons that it changed. Suffice it to say that the Reagan administration brought with it a culture and policies that not only encouraged the drive for profits, but celebrated it. It was seen as something close to civic virtue to work for profits. In addition, there was a very specific change that was of great importance. In 1980, Congress passed the Bayh-Dole Act. That permitted academic medical centers to patent the fruits of NIH-funded research and then license that exclusively to drug companies in return for royalties. Are you all familiar with Bayh-Dole, that act? Well, it was of major importance. It was in 1980, and then several similar pieces of legislation applied to the NIH itself, to research done on the NIH campus in Bethesda, and to academic medical centers. The royalties, and this was a part of the law, the royalties were to be divided among the investigators, their departments, and the institution. Before Bayh-Dole, the fruits of publicly funded research could not be patented. They were available to everyone. And you've probably heard the story when Jonas Salk was asked on a television interview whether he had patented his polio vaccine. He said, well, of course not. Could you patent the sun? He said it belongs to everybody. It was just a strange notion to him. The ostensible purpose of Bayh-Dole was to create an incentive to speed the translation of research to practical use at the bedside. This was in 1980. There was some feeling that, in general, the Japanese were getting ahead of us in technology transfer, what was called technology transfer from the research bench to the bedside. And Bayh-Dole applied not just to medicine, but to other research done with public funding in universities. And the idea was that this would provide an incentive to speed the translation. Whether Bayh-Dole fulfilled that promise is debatable. There were certainly more patents, but whether those patents were for useful devices, because there were changes in the patent law that relaxed patents so that almost anything could be patented, the color and shape of a pill, for example. There were more patents, but whether they really were translating useful research at the bedside is arguable. But what did happen, what Bayh-Dole did do, is that almost overnight, academic medical centers became junior partners of industry in a joint entrepreneurial quest. Investigators and their institutions patented early discoveries, often created startup companies to do the early development, and that's why major academic medical centers are now surrounded by startup biotech companies. They would set these up, do the early development, and then license the products to the drug companies. Note that drug companies no longer had to do their own innovative early research, and they now do almost none of it. They just feed off of publicly funded research. Note also that the medical centers weren't required to grant exclusive licenses. They could have left their discoveries in the public domain or granted non-exclusive licenses. Stanford did this with a patent that it owns on a biotechnology procedure, and for $10,000 a pop, roughly, anyone can use it. So you have to pay a licensing fee, but it isn't a huge licensing fee, and it's not exclusive. But most academic medical centers don't do that. They go the exclusive route because then they get the royalties. So the boundaries between industry and academia became increasingly blurred as both sought to maximize their income. Incidentally, the Bayh-Dole Act includes a provision, it's written out in the Act, that products that stem from NIH-funded research will be made available to the public on, quote, reasonable terms. That's in the Act. But both industry and academia have ignored that provision because it's advantageous for them for drugs to be priced as high as the market will bear. And they make no effort to enforce that provision. How did all this affect the relationships between industry and medical journals? I'll speak about the New England Journal of Medicine and the changes I observed directly because there's every reason to think that the effects were at least as great at other journals. First, the new partnership between industry and academic medicine affected the research agenda and therefore the sorts of papers submitted to us. Instead of focusing mainly on early-stage research into the causes and mechanisms of disease, academic investigators began to focus on research that might be profitable, that might be patentable. Medical schools and teaching hospitals became entrepreneurial, looking for the main chance. And it's just one example. Shiseido Cosmetic Manufacturer, Japanese cosmetic firm, gave the Massachusetts General Hospital, what we in Boston call man's greatest hospital, MGH, gave the MGH $180 million over 10 years for rights of first refusal on any discoveries in the dermatology department. Now, I don't know this for a fact, but I can't help but think that probably changed the research agenda in the dermatology department from serious skin diseases like pemphigus vulgaris to age spots and wrinkles. And you can see how the agenda can be changed by such a gift. Second, the partnership changed the terms of industry support. Sponsorship was no longer at arm's length. Drug companies became intimately involved in all aspects of the research they sponsored. They insisted on that. They often designed studies to be carried out by academic investigators who were little more than hired hands They kept the data, the sponsor kept the data, they claimed that they owned the data, and in some multi-center trials did not even give investigators access to all of their own data. In addition, they analyzed and interpreted the results. They often wrote the papers or hired companies to do that and determined whether and where the papers would be submitted for publication. Over the years, it became clear that sponsors almost routinely suppressed negative results. They simply wouldn't permit them to be published. There was a recent study by, I think the first author was named Turner, who was looking at 74 clinical trials of antidepressants. And he and his colleagues found that 37 of 38 positive studies, nearly all of the positive studies, were published. But of the 36 negative studies, 33, nearly all of those, were not published at all or misleadingly published to convey positive results when they were really negative trials. Probably suppression of negative results is the most important source of bias in the medical literature. And third, the partnership between industry and academia changed the relationship between academic investigators and sponsors. Investigators often had various other financial arrangements with the sponsors of their research. For example, they worked as consultants or speakers for the same companies that were sponsoring their research. The amounts of money they could earn from such activities from their other commercial ties were not trivial. The chairman of the psychiatry department at Brown, a man named Martin Keller, was reported, and now we're talking a good 10 years ago, to have made $500,000 as a consultant and speaker for drug companies that made antidepressants in just 1 year. So he more than doubled his salary. And yet, as the chairman of the psychiatry department, he presumably had a full-time job. So the amounts that researchers can make are not trivial. During my first years at the New England Journal of Medicine, we became aware that authors of submitted manuscripts often had multiple ties to the companies that sponsored their research, and that the papers were sometimes blatantly biased in favor of the sponsors' products. We could no longer depend on institutions to oversee conflicts of interest, since they themselves had deals with the same companies. In 1984, Relman decided to ask authors to disclose to us their financial ties with industry. We didn't send this information to peer reviewers, nor did we always publish the disclosures, but often we did. We were the first medical journal to adopt such a policy, which at first many authors resented. But over the next several years, other journals followed suit, and it became fairly well accepted. In 1990, we extended that policy. We decided that authors of editorials and review articles, that is, articles that contain no primary data, so readers can't look at the primary data for themselves, they depend on the author's judgment and the author's selection of studies to review. We decided that authors of these kinds of articles should have no financial ties to companies that would be affected by their article. That disclosure was not enough. We flatly prohibited conflicts of interest for these types of articles, since they were especially vulnerable to hidden bias. It was sometimes very difficult to find authors for editorials and review articles who did not have conflicts of interest, particularly in certain specialties such as psychiatry, dermatology, orthopedics, and cardiology. But it was not impossible, and we held to the policy for the next decade. After Relman was succeeded by Jerome Cassirer, and Cassirer by me. Unfortunately, we remained the only journal with such a policy, and it was abandoned by my successor. Relman also prohibited the editors from investing in any healthcare business. I believe that's also unique. I think other journals have a policy that you recuse yourself from decisions affecting a paper that touches on a financial interest you have. But editors are allowed to have such connections. At the New England Journal, we were not allowed to have any such connection. Relman said to the rest of the staff, you can invest in racehorses, rubies, real estate, but you cannot invest in the healthcare business. I could see the importance of that when the first manuscript on Viagra was submitted to the New England Journal of Medicine. If any of us had invested in Pfizer then, and believe me, it was tempting, it would not only have compromised us, but would have been tantamount to insider trading. I think there's a lot of stuff that goes on in academic medicine that really amounts to insider trading, but the SEC hasn't thought of it yet. Conflicts of interest became so pervasive that my colleagues and I had to be constantly vigilant for evidence of bias, which was sometimes very subtle. A few examples. A manuscript might come to us that talks about a wonderful drug, and side effects aren't mentioned. Just not mentioned. And I can remember phoning an author and said, there's nothing about side effects in your paper. He said, oh, the sponsors wouldn't let us do that. It was as though it was a reasonable answer to that question. Or papers will present positive data, not negative data, sometimes by changing the primary outcome as they go along to whatever is looking like it might be positive. Even placebo-controlled trials are often misleading. The real question will be, how does this new drug compare with an existing drug, what we're already using, not how does it compare with a sugar pill. I remember one of the first major studies of angiotensin receptor blockers, like Diovan. It was a placebo-controlled trial, and yet everyone wanted to know, how does this compare with ACE inhibitors? And this, again, was something that the sponsors insisted that it be placebo-controlled. In May of 2000, shortly before I ended my tenure at the New England Journal of Medicine, I wrote an editorial entitled, Is Academic Medicine for Sale? It was prompted by a clinical trial of an antidepressant called Surzone that was published in the same issue of the journal. The authors of that paper had so many financial ties to drug companies, in fact, one of them was this Martin Keller person from Brown, so many financial ties to drug companies, including the maker of Surzone, that a full disclosure statement would have been almost as long as the article itself. So it could appear only on our website. And we did publish it with this disclosure on the website. Among the many letters to the editor I received in response to my editorial, two were particularly pointed. One asked rhetorically, is academic medicine for sale? And then answered, these days everything is for sale. The second went further. It asked, again rhetorically, is academic medicine for sale? And answered, no, the current owner is very happy with it. Lily Tomlin once said, no matter how cynical I become, I can never quite keep up. I think I was always more skeptical than the average editor, but in retrospect, not skeptical enough. I no longer believe that disclosure and vigilance are enough. As the Institute of Medicine pointed out in its 2009 report on conflicts of interest, disclosure doesn't eliminate the conflict of interest. It just passes the burden along to try to decide whether that affected the work or not. And that's not fair. It's not fair to readers. It's not fair to people who come to the CME. If you go to a CME talk, the first slide says, I am up to my kazoo with the following 30 companies. And it's said as though, so now I get to say anything I want. And it's also almost seen as, I'm really important. It doesn't have the effect it should have, the caveat emptor effect it should have. It's just one of their, part of their plumage. And there are forms of bias that simply can't be spotted in an editorial office. There is no substitute for a disinterested investigator. If I had it to do again, I would have rejected the article that prompted my editorial, Is Academic Medicine for Sale? I wouldn't have published the Surzone study at all. Industry sponsorship of clinical research is, I believe, acceptable. But the investigators should not have any other financial ties to the sponsoring company. They shouldn't be consultants or speakers or anything else. In addition, sponsors should have no input into the conduct or publication or design of the study. Zero, none. And institutions should have no financial interest in companies whose products their faculty are evaluating. Since I stepped down as editor-in-chief, the FDA and the influential International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, ICJME, otherwise known as the Vancouver Group, which was co-founded by Relman in 1977, have instituted requirements for the registration of clinical trials on publicly accessible websites, like clinicaltrials.gov. Unfortunately, both sets of requirements, the Vancouver Group and the FDA, have loopholes and are only spottily enforced. They don't do the job. I believe that all clinical trials, phase 1 through 4, should be registered as the price of carrying out research on human subjects. After all, they're using members of the population, of the public, and they owe something in return. They ought to tell people who participate in these trials and everyone else exactly what they're studying and what the trial is. The registration should include the endpoints and the length of the trial, so they can't shift the goalposts as they go along. There was a very famous story about a one-year study of Celebrex that was a negative study. So the authors, sponsored by, what is that, Pfizer that makes Celebrex, sponsored by Pfizer, and the authors submitted the first 6 months, which were positive. Those positive results disappeared to JAMA. It was published in JAMA as a 6-month study, and only then did it come out that it was a one-year study. Now, if that had been registered on a publicly available website as a one-year study, that couldn't have happened. They couldn't wait to see how it was coming out. And then after the trial is complete, the salient results should be added to that website within 6 months. I would favor repeal or modification of the Bayh-Dole Act, but short of that, all of its terms should be honored, including the requirement that products discovered through NIH-funded research be made available to the public on reasonable terms. Why should taxpayers have to pay exorbitant prices for drugs they financed in the first place? Now, I asked earlier what would have happened if all the advertisers that threatened to pull out of the New England Journal of Medicine at once. Well, we were the only journal that could have survived on subscription income alone. No other journal could have done that. But the pressure from the Massachusetts Medical Society would have been insurmountable anyway. They had grown accustomed to living in the style to which they were living. We the editors, would have had to capitulate or been fired. In my view, medical journals should not carry any ads for drugs or devices. Now, I said earlier the rule was it had to be ads for FDA-approved drugs or devices. I've changed my mind about that. I think that journals, medical journals, should not carry any ads for drugs or devices because it's almost inevitably corrupting. I would rather see ads for real estate or consumer products or cars that have nothing to do with health care. Ideally, journals would be supported by readers. by authors, as in the case of PLOS, or by the professional organizations that own them. That means there would be many fewer journals, but they would be better. And the only loss would be to the companies that use journals to push their products. Until the medical profession and academic medicine get serious about dealing with the conflicts of interest that permeate our system, it will be extremely difficult for doctors to know what to believe. Thank you, and I'll take any. There's a.
Thank you very much for your talk and your leadership in your position. I'm Chris McCoy from Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. A question about ghostwriting. One of the things that's interesting to me is if we had a student who presented a paper that they did not write, put their name on, we would dismiss them from the school for plagiarism. And yet professors do this all the time, and we seem to have a double standard for them. So how do we address this issue?
Yeah, I think it's an important issue. Particularly when the ghostwriting, the Mayo Clinic has a writing office, or it did when I was at the Journal. They did a nice job. They helped the investigators, who seldom were good writers themselves, to make a readable manuscript. But they had no conflict of interest. And what happens with most ghostwriting is the ghostwriting is done by for-profit writing companies whose only clients are the drug companies. So they just sort of do the paper for the drug companies. I think it's a terrible situation, and I think that the journals should be very clear that this is an ethical violation, and when they see it, it should be stopped. They shouldn't publish the paper. There's guest authorship and there's ghost authorship. There is a sort of view that because this kind of ghost authorship is so bad, that people who actually write the paper, people who work for the company and actually write the paper, shouldn't be authors. Well, of course they should be authors. If they fulfill the criteria for authorship, they ought to be authors, no matter who they work for. You have a right to sue. And every one of the authors, 5 or 6 authors, everyone should fulfill those criteria. Nobody should be there just because he's the head of the department or got the grant or runs the lab. So both extremes ought to be stopped in any way we can. And the institutions, as in so many areas, they are closer to what goes on than the journals. And they ought to be on this. They just wink at it. I have to give you an example. When I was working at the Journal as executive editor, Jerry Kassir was the editor. And we got a manuscript for submission, and it was an original piece of research. And clipped to the back of it, by mistake, was a review article written by a writing company. And the covering letter said, okay, send it to this journal, and it wasn't our journal, send it to such and such journal, this is their address, here is your covering letter, sign the covering letter, written this covering letter, and then attached to it was a manuscript it was on antidepressants for PTSD, it was in the psychiatry field, and there were maybe 4 or 5 little handwritten corrections. And those corrections were to kind of tamp down the most excessive claims for the drug. So the one sentence said, and this drug always cures PTSD, and then in handwriting, almost always, not quite, was in the margin or something. And that was it. Other than that, there were no changes. So Jerry phoned up this guy and said, your secretary made a mistake. He should have been mortified. He should have been mortified. He said, oh, okay, thanks for letting me know. And then Jerry said, and the paper you submitted to us, how do we know that you wrote that? He said, oh, that one I wrote. And so Jerry said, sorry, we don't believe you, and we sent them both back. But he should have been embarrassed, and he wasn't.
We have a question over here. State your name. Where you're from.
I'm Ruben Thakar, a pediatrician from Seattle. My question is regarding some of the newer regulations regarding disclosures, regarding researchers engaged in federally funded research. The disclosure laws all seem to put the institutions in charge of monitoring their own researchers, but many institutions themselves receive significant funding from the industry.
Right.
So I wonder if they truly are the right entities to be doing that monitoring, and if they're not, how can you actually monitor researchers, and who would be the right people to do that?
Yeah. The old rules, the ones that have been in effect for decades, said that an NIH-funded researcher who made more than $10,000 from a company should inform his institution, and the institution would decide how to manage it and whether it had to be reported to the NIH. And in practice, the institutions didn't do anything, and it was never reported to the NIH, maybe 4 times in a few remarkable cases over the years, but nothing happened. And certainly the 10,000 limit was not adhered to at all. The new rules are supposedly tougher, and they say anything over 5,000 must be reported to the NIH. It's not enough for the institution to say, we're managing it. The institution has to say, yes, and we're managing it, and this is how we're managing it. These were just implemented within the last year. And I don't know how that's going to work out, but I don't think the incentives change much. The incentives are for the institutions to continue to allow their faculty to make as much as they possibly can. The institution then doesn't have to pay them as much. And the NIH, which has such close relationships with the academic institutions, it's a revolving door. People go back and forth from academia to the NIH. They don't have any interest in doing it either. They also have a conflict of interest problem. So I don't know how this will work out. I can see some argument for industry academic collaboration in basic research, although I see no argument for the researcher to get personal payments for that. But I can see some argument for collaboration. Most of what we're talking about is in clinical research, where the device is already made, or the pill has already been through early research, and this is phase 3. That's where most of the big money comes into the academic medical centers. The reason is that they want what's known as key opinion leaders. They want to win the hearts and minds of faculty leaders who write the papers, the textbooks, give the talks, the CME talks. So that's where it goes. I see no excuse for clinical researchers to be taking money from companies, drug companies, device companies, for any reason. So I guess what I would say, and I also see no justification for drug companies being involved in CME. I mean, one of the definitions of a learned profession is that you educate your own. You don't leave it to interested companies to do that. So I think the institutions, if they were serious about eliminating conflicts of interest instead of, quote, managing them, then that would matter. And then also when there are violations, as in the case of, say, Charles Nemiroff, the psychiatrist, there ought to be real punishment. It's like maybe a speed limit of 55 miles an hour. So you're not going to catch everybody doing 85, but all you need to do is catch a couple to kind of dissuade people from doing that. And I think all you need to do is catch a couple of people flouting the industry regulations grossly. Yes.
One more question.
I was just wondering, do you think that there's roles for the state licensing boards, the federal, or state legislation, or is there just not enough power in those, given the industry's power, to make any difference?
Well, there's plenty of power if they'll use it. And there are sunshine laws in Massachusetts. There are loopholes in those. And in Vermont, I believe, in Minnesota. And then a part of the ACA will be a sunshine law. But there are a lot of loopholes there. They do have the power if they would do it. Loopholes, for example, only phase 4 studies and not pre-marketing studies because they're proprietary, and other kinds of loopholes. If federal law says it's illegal to market drugs for off-label uses and to pay doctors kickbacks unless. And in the regulations, there is an unless, and that unless is unless it's a part of education or research. And so the drug companies disguise what they do as education or research. And so these sunshine laws don't always capture that. But they have the power to do it. And I think Grassley has been very good in making sure that this is done at a federal level. Not my favorite senator in most ways, but in this way, yes.
Okay, I think we need to wrap up now. But thank you very much for a great talk.
You're quite
and for coming down here today.